Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mary Chris, and for today's video, we're going to tackle Chapter 2 of Brown Skin, White Minds, Filipino American Postcolonial Psychology by E.J.R. David. This videos tend to be long-ish, so let's get started, shall we? Chapter 2 is called The Catholic Convent Spanish Colonialism. Despite the rich and significant amount of cultural beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, as well as the well-established and complex social systems and institutions that existed prior to European occupation, as discussed in the previous chapter, Filipino history is often summarized by many Filipinos and Filipino Americans in one phrase: 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. This is evidence suggesting that many individuals with Filipino heritage may not have a very good understanding of their historical and cultural roots, that they may lack a strong, authentic, and positive Filipino knowledge base that may contribute to developing pride toward their heritage. This limited and inaccurate representation of Filipino history sends the message that nothing existed prior to arrival of Europeans, that Filipinos owe everything they know, and even their survival, to their European or Western colonizers. This popular summary of Filipino history also touches on the persistent legacies of both colonial periods on modern-day Filipino and Filipino Americans. It expresses the continued Catholic influence on most Filipinos and Filipino Americans, and suggests that Filipinos and Filipino Americans view American colonialism as liberating, pleasurable, and enlightening experience. Certainly, the simplified but popular single-sentence summation of Philippine history reveals that Filipino culture and how culture influenced Filipino and Filipino American thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, and emotions cannot be completely understood outside the simple fact that the modern-day Filipino and Filipino Americans are mostly Christian, primarily Catholic, have high English proficiency, and are highly familiar with American culture. Instead of worshiping Bethala or being highly proficient in Baybayin, tells us that something historically significant must have happened for the indigenous Tao to have changed so much. Such historically significant events and periods are the indigenous Tao's colonial experiences. Thus, I now provide the brief discussion of Filipinos' colonial experiences, beginning with Spanish colonialism. So, I also found that I totally agree with him. And also, when he says Filipino Americans, I'm just gonna mean Filipinos. I think this doesn't just apply to Filipino Americans. It just applies to every Filipinos, in my opinion. But yeah, we kind of revere that, hey, it's a good thing, Spanish was here, we know a little bit of Spanish, and it's like, it's a good thing that Americans came here because we had education, even though Filipinos were already literate. And they were called the Tao, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines, even before Spain came to our country. So, don't be fooled, my fellow Filipinos. We would have been fine without European intervention, or American intervention at that. So his next one is called Tackling Some Historical Myths. Ooh, I love this. I love this. In 1521, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan landed and claimed a large set of island archipelago in the Pacific for Spain. This signaled the beginning of Spanish occupation of the Tao, exploitation of the Tao and their lands, and transformation of Tao's indigenous culture and ways of life, remembering the existence of Tao and their highly developed culture and society is important to emphasize here, because it reifies the fact that Ferdinand Magellan did not discover the Philippines. After Magellan, other Spanish voyages followed the path he took to get to the island archipelago. And in 1542, Spanish explorer Ruy Lopez de Villalobos named the islands Las Islas Filipinas, the Philippine Islands, in honor of Spain's King Charles I's son, Philip, who would later become King of Spain himself, King Philip II. All early Spanish voyages to the Philippines were met by resistance from the indigenous Tao, and it was not until 1571 when a later Spanish exploration led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi established the walled Spanish city of Manila, Intramuros, that Spain finally subdued the Tao struggle and secured Spanish rule over the islands. It is crucial to point out that it took approximately for Spain 50 years to quell the indigenous Tao's opposition to Spanish rule and cultural transformation. This particular point is important because it shows that indigenous Tao fought the occupiers, resisted the Spanish impositions, and tried to protect their ways of life, and did not simply welcome the Spanish colonizers with open arms, wanting to be civilized. Such strong resistance by the indigenous Tao is evidence that they were proud of their culture and ways of life, and that they did not automatically regard the Western people, the Western belief system, and the Western culture as better than they had. The barangay or barangay warriors, or tribal warriors, who were led by the respective datus or raja, which is king or chief, forced fiercely to protect the culture and ways of life that Tao were so proud of. In fact, the person who is considered to be the first circumnavigate the world, Ferdinand Magellan, lost his life in the Philippines against the warriors of one of the greatest indigenous datus. One moment. Excuse me. In fact, the person who is considered to be the first to circumnavigate the world, Ferdinand Magellan, lost his life in the Philippines against the warriors of one of the greatest indigenous datus in Filipino history, Lapu-Lapu. Thus, Ferdinand Magellan was not able to return to Spain and did not circumnavigate the world. Some of his men, led by Juan Sebastián de Elcano and one ship Victoria from his voyage, but Ferdinand Magellan did not. The Spanish colonizers also did not establish the capital of Manila. Manila, or Maynila as the indigenous Tao called it, Maynila, this is what the indigenous Tao called it, was a prosperous Muslim kingdom in the island of Luzon. Maynila was strategically located by the Pasig River and the bay opening up to the ocean of Manila Bay, allowing indigenous tribes such as the Tagalog or Tagailog, which literally means of the river, and the Kapangpangan, which literally means of the river bank, to trade with each other as well as with other neighboring Asian cultures such as the Chinese, Indians, and Indonesians. This early form of commerce made Maynila and the indigenous tribes who inhabited the lands and waters around it very wealthy. Datus such as Sulaiman, Lakandula, and Matanda were some of the leaders who governed the indigenous tribes around Maynila prior to and during Spanish occupation. The fact that multiple indigenous tribes were for the most part peacefully living with and mutually benefiting from each other in Maynila before Spanish occupation is evidence the indigenous Tao had developed an effective and mutually beneficial system of living and thriving. However, upon the discovery of the vast wealth in Maynila and the economic potential of its location, the Spanish explorer focused their attention on obtaining control over the area. Again, the indigenous Tao fought and resisted Spanish occupation through the help of advanced weaponry and the strategy of dividing and conquering. However, the Spanish defeated the Tao and eventually took over Maynila. Spanish oppression of the Tao. All Spanish voyages to the archipelago that followed Ferdinand Magellan's initial exploration consistently reported to the Spanish king that vast amounts of spices, gold, and other valuable resources may be found in the islands, especially in Maynila. By 1574, the Maynila, as insigne y siempre leal ciudad de España, distinguished ever loyal city of Spain, and the capital of the new colony where government policies for all the islands would begin. Increasing numbers of Spanish officials, missionaries, and soldiers from Spain and from Mexico, which is another Spanish colony at that time, were assigned to live and govern the new colony. Indeed, there were many similarities between Philippine and Mexico colonies in terms of how they were governed by Spain. For instance, there was the union of church and state in such colonies, and not surprisingly, the strong push for propagation of Catholic among the indigenous peoples. Indeed, as part of Spain's civilization efforts, the Tao's indigenous culture and spiritual beliefs were replaced by Spanish culture and Catholic religion. As a matter of fact, the Catholic religion was the primary tool by which the Spanish colonizer were able to convince indigenous Tao that Spanish ways of life were superior and more civilized than Tao's indigenous ways and temper their resistance. Another significant government similarity between the Philippine colony, the Mexican colony, and other Spanish colonies in South America during the time is that the governments in such colonies were highly centralized, and the Governor General, the Spanish king's appointed representative in a colony, had control over the armed forces, the executive branch, and the judiciary branch, the local provincial officials, and even the church. Because of the immense power of the Governor General, it was easy for corruption to arise. This corruption trickled down to the Government General's appointed judicial, executive, military, provincial, and church officials. The Spanish officials, who were called Filipinos, along with other Spanish people living in the colony at the time, also abused their power to the detriment of the colony and the lives of indigenous Tao. During Spanish rule, the indigenous Tao experienced severe exploitation, abuse, rape, slavery, brutality, corruption, injustice, and tyranny, as their dignity and honor were continuously taken for granted by the Spanish. The Filipino national hero Jose Rizal, along with other indigenous Tao leaders, argued against oppression of the Tao or the Indios, as the Spanish referred to the indigenous Tao, and attempted to work toward equal treatment of all who lived in the colony. The Filipinos and Tao or Indios, in fact, Jose Rizal promoted the idea that everyone in the colony, including Tao or Indios, be called Filipinos, to erase the division between the privileged and the oppressed and promote equality for all. Among his many writings that documented the oppressed lives of Tao under Spanish rule are the popular and powerful novels Nombre Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. However, these peaceful attempts to reform were not welcomed by those in control. And in 1896, Jose Rizal was executed by Spain in Bagong Bayan because of his criticism of Spanish rule. The Golden Legend and Colonial Debt. One of Jose Rizal's many writings included the following passage: little by little, they lost their old traditions, the mementos of their past. They gave up writing their songs, their poems, their laws in order to learn by rote other doctrines which they did not understand, another morality, another aesthetics, different from those inspired by their climate and their manner of thinking. Degrading themselves in their own eyes, they become ashamed of what was their own. They began to admire and praise whatever was foreign and incomprehensible. Their spirit was dismayed and surrendered this disgust of themselves. Based on Jose Rizal's description of the indigenous Tao's living condition under Spain and its resulting psychological effects, the centuries in which the Tao were under Spanish rule can be marked as a time when Tao began to develop colonial mentality, a condition in which the oppressed perceives oneself as inferior to the oppressor, or as Jose Rizal described it, when Tao began to degrade themselves, to be ashamed of their culture and to be disgusted of their characteristics. Colonial mentality has immense implication in the thinking, behaviors, emotions, and attitude of the modern day Filipino, and is a phenomenon that is explored in more detail in part 2, and we'll discuss that later on. In addition to and related with colonial mentality, the Tao has developed a sense of colonial debt, a condition that is characterized by a deferential attitude towards Spanish culture and Spanish people, and the tendency to accept maltreatments by Spanish rulers as the natural cause of progress or civilization. This feeling of indebtedness toward their Spanish colonizers have developed during Spanish rule may still be widely held among modern-day Filipinos and Filipino Americans as maintained by the Golden Legend. The Golden Legend is a popular historical belief that the pre-Hispanic Filipinos were uncivilized savages who were nobly civilized by Spain through the gifts of Spanish culture and Catholicism. During the Spanish rule, Remonte asserted that Catholic Church and its friars were instrumental in endorsing the Golden Legend by promoting the idea that those who did not Hispanicize had strayed from the prescribed Catholic path of righteousness. The Golden Legend has been maintained throughout the years in more contemporary presentations of Filipino history, as even noted Filipino historian Teodoro Agoncillo was known to praise the beautiful Spanish language and the Catholic religion, which he regarded as the most poetic of all religions. We're on the chapter summary now. The Spanish occupation of the islands we now know as the Philippines was driven by Spanish kingdom's desire for more power and wealth, as well as to propagate the Catholic religion. Such motivations were typical among the Western nations such as Spain, Portugal, France, and others during this time. This typical set of motivators for expansion and colonialization are usually referred as the 3 Gs: God, Gold, and Glory. The now world-famous explorer Ferdinand Magellan led the first of many Spanish voyages motivated by the 3 Gs to land in the Philippines, because we now know that many other peoples with diverse languages and cultural worldviews have been living, developing, and thriving in the Philippines long before Ferdinand Magellan got there. We also know that the Western-centric myth that Ferdinand Magellan discovered Philippines is not true. It is perhaps more accurate to say that Ferdinand Magellan and the resulting Spanish colonization significantly changed the lives of the indigenous Tao who lived the islands now known as Philippines. Despite more advanced weaponry, it took the Spanish occupiers approximately half a century to defeat the indigenous Tao. Excuse me. Evidencing the Tao's impressive combat skills in supporting the notion that the Tao fiercely fought for the protection of their culture and the ways of life. Furthermore, although there were many similarities between the colonial experience and the indigenous Tao and those of other Spanish colonial experiences, Furthermore, although there were many similarities between the colonial experience of indigenous Tao and those of other Spanish colonies in Latin America, one of the major differences is the continued survival of hundreds of indigenous Tao language to this day, despite centuries of Spanish colonialism and oppression. Unlike many formerly Spanish colonies in Latin America that are now predominantly Spanish-speaking, this is another evidence of the strong resistance among the indigenous Tao against Spain in order to keep their indigenous cultures and ways of life, and also speaking to the Tao's resilience as people. Despite the strong resistance from the indigenous Tao, however, Spain was eventually able to take control over the island archipelago, including the major city of Manila. Spain established a corrupt colony that oppressed the indigenous Tao, exploited the rich natural resources and people, changed their indigenous ways of life, and propagated Catholic religion. By this time, many of the indigenous ways of life, forms of government, spiritual beliefs, language, arts, writing systems, and other aspects of indigenous culture were demonized as being those of uncivilized and were replaced by supposedly more civilized and better ways of Spanish. Such an oppressive process is exactly what the influential postcolonial scholar Edward Said in 1979 described in his seminal book Orientalism, where he presented the ways in which various European colonizers have portrayed peoples of the Orient as primitive, uncivilized, or inferior. The Spanish period in the lives of the Tao may be marked as the beginning of the development of the colonial mentality, a condition explored later in the beginning of Chapter 5. After being subjected to more than 300 years of ethnic and cultural subjugation, and partly sparked by the unjustified execution of Jose Rizal, a series of Filipino revolutions seriously disrupted Spain's control over the Philippines toward the end of the 19th century. Such revolutions were led by the recognized heroes such as Andres Bonifacio, Emilio Aguinaldo, Marcel H. del Pilar, and Apolinario Mabini, among many others. Although such revolutions were encouraged by the United States because the United States were involved in a war against Spain at that time, the Filipino Revolution against Spain was already successful before American forces even landed in the Philippines. Indeed, the Filipino revolutionaries were already able to gain control of the entire island of Luzon, where Manila is located, and declared their independence. They also established the first Asian government, the First Philippine Republic, based on a democratically developed constitution, the Malolos Constitution, and elected their first president in General Emilio Aguinaldo. However, the Filipinos' independence was short-lived as Spain sold the Philippines along with Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam to the United States for $20 million. During the Treaty of Paris in 1898, which signaled the end of the Spanish-American War and setting the stage for beginning of yet another long period of colonization for Filipinos. The next chapter will discuss the American occupation of colonization of the Philippines, and I'm looking forward to that. That would be for next week. This book is just so amazing. Okay, guys, If you like books, subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, subscribe, like, and share it to your fellow book lovers. See you next time. Bye!